Thank you, Julie. Am I all properly mic'd here? And it's very nice to be here for Julie's return as the assistant director, one of our wonderful PhD students from years past, and it's great to have her back doing this in this capacity. So thank you for that. Well, thank you all for the opportunity to work out and work through a topic that I didn't think I was going to write about at all in the course of my research into Syrian refugees and flight from the Syrian civil war. But it kept coming up as a recurring theme, and not in a simple way, in the stories that my interlocutors were telling me. At every stage along the route that people were taking from the decision to leave their homes in Damascus through phases of flight and refuge and exile that took them to Jordan, to Lebanon, to Turkey, and then eventually propelled them across the Aegean, through Eastern Europe, and up into Western Europe, for some of them. There were lots and lots of narratives and discourses about education, about the children, about schools. And so when I was asked to participate in this wonderful gathering, this workshop for educators, it occurred to me that maybe this would be an opportunity to try and apply and pull together some of these questions, for surely they apply to other populations in flight, in exile. And you can think of migrants from Africa, from North Africa, from Southeast Asia, and in particular on the North American continent, people coming up seeking opportunities and seeking education as they move from Central America and point south through Mexico and up into the United States. And who better to talk about this with than educators? So this is very much a work in progress, ideas in progress, and I hope you will give me the feedback that occurs to you as we talk about this topic. So, and what I put up here is just a little drawing from one of the Syrian refugees of her future aspiration of being a math teacher. And you see a lot of poignant discourse on the part of children. What do you actually miss about Syria? And of course, one of the things that's most disrupted and most missed was the process of being in school. And it has been disastrous. Education is also a nice framework to look at because, as in this quote from the UNHCR, the UN High Commission on Refugees, it is in the world of rights and in the world of human rights, an aspirational human right that very few people would question. That again, as a right, as a goal, it is highly motivating. Individuals are drawn on in search of a very specific structured type of education, and the countries that they leave, the countries that they pass through, the countries that they're heading for, also share this aspiration to be able to provide that right, certainly of primary education, but also of secondary education. So it's a pretty uncomplicated, motivating, and aspirational rights framework. Of course, what it looks like on the ground is highly problematic. So again, if I were to give an academic title or subtitle to this talk today, it would be something about moving from precarious education and also being driven from precarious educational situations towards a kind of education in precarity, an education that is not being carried out in functional schools. There aren't enough of them. The ones that are leaping up to serve the needs end up being little microcosms of the dysfunctions of the community that is passing through and the territory that they are passing through, as well as any other outside interests that come into play. And what you end up getting instead is a kind, rather than the education to which people aspire, in which basic literacy and skills are smoothly conveyed to children, what you get is an education in what we might call precarity. To put this another way, it's an education on the road, and it's an education in the old school hard knocks kind of way, with some interesting new additions and skills that I hope we'll talk about. What I'm doing for my research is following a group of families who are linked by kinship, basically organized around 5 middle-aged sisters and their families. And what's been particularly interesting in this extended family-based ethnography is to look how members of the same family, as they have their own children and as they are at various stages in their own household life cycle, make different kinds of decisions. They don't all act in lockstep. Each sister, some with older children who are already married, have a different set of priorities and calculuses. The ones with younger children in particular are the ones who are driven by education. And so in this particular talk, I focus on the experience of the 2 youngest of these middle-aged sisters who have children around the age of 9 or 10, boys and girls, as well as older boys in the very precarious 17-year-old range. And if I forget to talk about any particular segment of this population, remind me in the question and answer period, because it's very interesting. First thing that you notice is when people make this huge decision as to leave their country, to leave everything, their paid-off houses, the only home they've ever known, their entire social life and network, everything they have ever worked for, usually it is because of children. And for many of the refugees, and I'm not going to go into the statistics, I can answer questions about the statistics, we can do that in question and answer, but we're talking about millions of people displaced. For many of those millions, it's not actually about a direct threat to their physical safety, although it is shockingly about a physical threat to their safety. Bombs are coming down, the streets are impassable, but in talking to these families, one of the first trying to elicit from them, how do you get that ball rolling towards this massive displacement that you're about to undertake? It often has to do with education, with the fact that children are growing up in child time, okay, and children who were not even born at the beginning of the now 5-year Syrian conflict might not have seen the inside of a school. Children who were 6 years old are now approaching teenage years. 13-year-olds are now moving into that dangerous category of young man. And so parents are very much following the interests and the life cycle of their children. A year in school time is a year of learning that is missed. And there are only so many years. If your young son started out the war at age 14 and is now age 18 or 19, as happens with people, they are graduating from a controlled world of school into a world where they are more and more likely to be sucked into violence and combat, whether by being drafted into the military, an unthinkable position for most of them who are in opposition to the state, or in order to develop an alternate, being sucked into the many militias fighting on the opposition side. So particularly for 16, 17, 18-year-old boys, the threat that their parents see to their safety as they graduate is immense. So we see decisions, timing, risk-taking understood in terms of the imperative for education, the danger of falling out of education. And you see people talking about this in their own decision-making processes even more than questions of work, livelihood, or physical danger. And of course, for all the parents of those rising 18-year-old boys, what they really want to do is get them into some kind of vocational school, some kind of university program, rather than going on to be cannon fodder in this brutal, brutal conflict. Okay, so even more than gender, again, age and the life cycle of the household seems to be a driver. That's a repeat slide. This is borne out by some statistics. When you look at the refugee populations of the neighboring countries to Syria, you see this borne out in a pretty appreciable moving of the needle towards a even younger population. Already most Middle Eastern societies, as anyone who takes classes with me knows very well, are disproportionately young, with so many people under the age of 35, the majority of the population. As you move into those populations of refugees in the next door countries, you go from 73% within Syria being under age 75 to 81%. People are taking their children and getting out of there. And you have a large number of those single boys. Remember, nothing of this process is static. People age and they grow into that dangerous perceived age group as single young men. The ones who are used and portrayed at the height of the refugee hysteria as, again, scare tactics. That these are young men. Why are there so many men? Why are there so many men? Well, many of those men started as boys when this war started, and that's what happens when you have a 5 or 6 year conflict. The Syrian schools from which they're leaving were one of the great accomplishments of the Ba'athist state. Prior to the conflict, you had 99% enrollment with great gender parity in primary education and almost 90% secondary enrollment, again, with really good gender parity, doing a very good job of basic literacy and basic skills. Of course, that all is thrown into chaos by war. Okay? So again, in the individual narratives of families and particular parents, the point at which they start thinking of picking up and leaving is when their children have to run home from school to escape mortar fire, or snipers are positioned on the street and that the children need to walk to and from school. Poignant stories, again, not tragic, but poignant in their relationship to education, about being one exam away from your diploma when the institute's shut down because of the war, or I can't get to exams because there are 3 different checkpoints that I need to cross, and it's simply too dangerous. For more middle-class parents and for teachers also, schools become increasingly politicized during wartime. One of my key interlocutors was a well-established French teacher in a government school. And for her, it came down to certain kinds of political testing. The state puts pressure on the school administration. The school administration puts pressure on the teachers to put pressure on the students to show up for rallies supporting the government, for these great rallies. And as a French teacher, she took what was going to be a very dangerous political stance by saying, no, I am not going to make my students go out and march in rallies to support the state. It's their choice. And that seemingly neutral solution was enough within the politics of a government school to call into question her loyalties and to begin a harassment campaign that eventually made her uncomfortable enough that she knew she did not have a future. Okay? And again, boys growing up, facing challenges, and in their parents' eyes, being more and more vulnerable to getting sucked into actual combat. In terms of numbers, I'll give you a few numbers. As the war grinds on, you have 3.5 million internally displaced children, another 5.6 to 6 million children in need of humanitarian assistance within Syria, 2 to 2.5 million children out of school because the schools simply don't function anymore, another million at risk of dropping out at any point due to just how difficult it is to make ends meet with a war going on, but also in an economy where the currency is rapidly depreciating because of the constant state of war, and it takes ungodly amounts of money to buy a loaf of bread or a carton of eggs or what have you, and then it's all hands on deck. And again, a quarter of the school infrastructure, and this is probably statistics from before the devastating attack on Aleppo, where no hospital, no school was left undestroyed. Okay? So, people make that move for their kids. They go to the neighboring Arab countries. I want to talk about Lebanon for a bit, and this is a very common sight in the cities of Lebanon. Syrian children peddling Kleenex, flowers, gum, little boxes of gum, anything, these little consumer products that might easily be sold in the street. So you've got 700,000 children, Syrian refugee children, in Lebanon. Less than a third of them are in any kind of school. Most of them are contributing to family breadwinning. Okay, here's a graphic depiction of it. That yellow triangle there, the red are the children who are in Syrian coalition opposition schools. The orange are the ones who have managed to find a place in Lebanese schools. The yellow ones are the children who are working. And the larger blue one is the entire refugee population. So again, you see the size of the children's sector of those populations. And again, the largest part of it is not being schooled. So again, 90,000 kids have found a place in the Lebanese public schools because they're very different curriculum, and very importantly, different languages of instruction, French and English. That is pretty challenging. You have similar things going on in Jordan and Egypt, where some of my informants and their families spent time. In Jordan, you don't have the language problem, but in order to accommodate a larger percentage of the Syrian refugees, a smaller overall number, but a larger percentage, the Jordanian school day has been shortened, and there are second shifts in which Syrian children come in and take lessons in the afternoon. But Jordanian children have given up an hour or two of their school day in order to accommodate that, and they're kept separate. Because again, on the face of it, when you come in there and the Jordanian students start out their day with a pledge of allegiance to the king and his sublime position, okay, that's something that immediately is going to be recognizable and volatile for those Syrian students. Okay, so but it might be the least bad of the situations. In Egypt, in the first 2 years of the conflict, the Muslim Brotherhood government of Mohammed Morsi welcomed Syrian children into Egyptian schools and then was overthrown in a coup. And today, again, the children of Egypt are subject to systematic political bullying in the Egyptian schools, being called Muslim Brotherhood. And these are little kids who are being burdened with the political issues of the host country, making them opt out for homeschooling. The Syrian opposition schools are really interesting. We don't have a lot of time to get into this. 100,000 students who don't fit in Lebanon, we're back in Lebanon now, in the Lebanese schools, are in these ad hoc Syrian opposition schools, which again, think back to my original title of dysfunctional schools. Again, everyone wants schools. School generally is better than not school or working in the street. But again, these schools that are cobbled together by funding from wealthy parties in the Gulf, NGOs, local teachers who are also refugees, have become little kind of petri dishes for all the different kinds of conflicts and issues swirling around the children and their families. So, for example, and a lot of my kind of narratives within the ethnography are about how the mothers of these children glom onto these schools and volunteer their labor so that their children will have a place in the schools. The schools are funded by distant, unknown donors with agendas of their own, but the children are still charged, the families are still charged fees. And once you get into the politics of a school, and I'm sure every one of us knows this as educators, the school itself is a little microcosm of politics. So one of my key interlocutors, by sheer talent and working hard, got her daughters into a school, volunteering as an assistant gym teacher until her talents were noticed. And she had a particular obsession that she talks about a lot as she spent over a year in Lebanon, her obsession as a gym teacher was to try and get these children to stand in lines. And every day she would exhort them in this chaotic environment to just learn to stand in line and wait your turn in line. And she would tell them, how are we ever going to put our country back together if you can't stand in lines, if you can't wait your turn, if it's always rushing to the fore? But she despaired because at the same time she, like all her students, would go for their aid assistance from the UN, and she would see the parents of the kids jostling, fighting, pushing to get what they needed to survive. So she was quite obsessed and quite articulate about the role of schools in putting the society back together. Eventually she uncovered a major cheating scandal in which the director of the school was, somewhat predictably, facilitating cheating and changing of grades in again, perhaps not surprising, in a situation in which certification is everything and chaos is everywhere. So the director was caught aiding a widespread cheating network based on her relatives, and of course my interlocutor who uncovered this was fired. So again, you can imagine a school as a sort of a microcosm of all these different politics. And again, those were the lucky ones, the ones who even got into school, had the luxury and leisure of going to school. For 2/3 of the kids in Lebanon, it is work with no protection, needless to say. Very interesting for my families, when you're in a situation like that, where your professional values are actually going to cause you to get fired, where the school becomes a warehouse for corruption and cheating and other people's political agendas, that's when the despair sets in. And eventually, after a serious psychological and family crisis, they decide to move on to Turkey. Another sister decides to move on to Turkey because for her high school students, the only place where the Syrian opposition educational certification will be recognized is Turkey. So optimistically, once you've done what you can do within those opposition schools, you look for a country, a context where that diploma will be recognized, and there's only one place where for political reasons it would be recognized, namely Turkey. So eventually, all of my families feel like they've exhausted themselves and exhausted the educational possibilities and are quite despairing within Lebanon, and they move on to Turkey, where you have a kind of an out of the frying pan into the fire situation as far as education is concerned. Yes, your certificates and diplomas will be recognized, but if you had a language program in Lebanon where Arabic was the underlying language and you move to Turkey, you have a compounded double language problem. You have to learn either English or Turkish in order to get that secondary training, which you are now qualified to do. And although for many Syrian refugees, Turkey seems like a more welcoming host country for religious and political reasons, the language barrier, the necessity of bonding with someone who knows the language better than you do, puts you at the mercy of a whole emergent class of educational brokers. So this family spent a lot of time paying money to educational brokers who will promise to translate your diploma and get you into an Arabic-speaking academy, what have you. In spite of all the goodwill, in spite of all the NGOs, in spite of the opportunities, in Turkey you still have, again, within a population that's probably now a lot larger than that, and there are peculiarities about Turkey that we can talk about, and the legal status of guests rather than refugees, the necessity of having government ID papers in order to get into schools. It results in hundreds of thousands of kids for whom it's preferable to work than to start climbing yet another educational mountain. And interestingly, with Turkey's much larger economy, the opportunities for work are much more systematic in Turkey for child labor than they were in Lebanon and other neighboring Arab countries where you saw children peddling on the streets. Here, the massive textile sector and agricultural sector provides lots and lots of work. And children, like adults in Turkey, without any kind of legal protection, although there is more goodwill at the social and cultural level, are still working 12-hour days, 14-hour days, particularly in the textile industry. Okay? Eventually that too, for my interlocutors, comes to a dead end. And I see among you today many of my wonderful graduate students who are going to know more about these topics than I am. So like Mija, who's working on NGO education programs, reaching in to fill the gap. But again, it's such a large gap. And it comes from donor-driven projects that come, agendas that come from the outside, dubious funding sources, not enough. There's nothing systematic about it. And just to, so as people despair, let me tell you one last nightmare story of the families in Turkey. Again, it was the same thing. Women volunteering their labor as former teachers, as future teachers, just to get their children in the door, to work for nothing, again, very long hours, et cetera, et cetera. When they realized, this family, that they had really reached the end of the educational road in Turkey, that there was no way that their 17 and 18-year-old sons, there's no physical way that they were going to be able to work their 14-hour shifts to pay the rent, while learning Turkish in preparation for a college degree. It just wasn't going to happen. So they began to call around for a smuggler, a human smuggler, to take them to the next educational horizon, the promised land of Europe, where in fact outcomes for those who get there have been better. So she's calling around. People are giving her phone numbers of smugglers. And this is part of the technological infrastructure of precarity, how people learn to do things and learn to survive and learn to plug into networks via phones and computers, Facebook groups, things like this. And she sees the number on her phone coming up as a familiar number. And it turns out that one of the human smuggling rings, not the one that they eventually decided to go to, was being rung, was leading her to a number that was familiar to her. It was one of her colleagues, a fellow teacher in the elementary school, was actually using the school as a base for collecting the enormous fees that the human smugglers collect in order to put people on small overcrowded boats, resulting in thousands of deaths by drowning, and that this was going on within the school, and the school was being used as a base for this. And it was very embarrassing. That teacher was in cahoots with her husband, who was a major smuggler, plugged into a Turkish-Syrian smuggling ring. And again, for the, and we can talk about this another time, I've written extensively about this horrible process of putting on that life vest and getting into a boat with dozens, possibly more than dozens of people climbing on top of you for a 4-hour journey to Greece. Well, often takes 4 hours. It should take half an hour if you had a properly weighted boat with enough gas in it, etc., etc. So again, the teacher was not actually recruiting from within the school, but the circumstances were such, and the teacher was very embarrassed to be found as part of this smuggling ring. They eventually went with one of the many other smugglers that were out there. But it was very close to home to realize that these operations were going on within these cobbled together schools, very precarious, And it was interesting because my interlocutor, once she realized that she had a connection with the smuggling operation, a human connection, she asked desperately for reassurance. You know my little 9-year-old son. He's going to go on this boat. Is it safe? Is it okay? Can you get us a better boat? The woman basically effectively hung up on her. She knew the risks. Everybody knew the risks. It was an issue. So I want to talk about how we might think of what people are actually learning. They're not learning in these NGO programs, and eventually they make it. My two families, after lots of adventures on the road, including, for one of them, a month-long detention on the Macedonian border in the miserable camps and rain that you might have seen in the news. When they get to Europe, it's very interesting because the ritual of reception, at least back in 2013 and 2014, for families with children who had made it on this long trek, was a really interesting one. And the children were received with candy and with toys. And when I went to visit one of the families in their new asylum location, you can just barely make it out here. They were so happy to have a tiny little room, just a long kind of dormitory-style room. And the first thing I realized was it was full of toys. There was this, on the part of the receiving society, at least while there was still enthusiastic support and welcome for Angela Merkel's policies, the young son of the family suddenly had a pile of board games and a uncomfortably large pile of stuffed animals, tennis rackets, bicycles, all these things, as this sort of ritual of welcome back to childhood happened. And for a child his age, immediately enrolled in sports programs. He was also enrolled in sports programs back in Turkey, but immediately there were pathways into the much more functional German educational system, although for older kids it's going to be quite different. But for younger kids, you see this a lot, the kids quickly picking up language, becoming not the breadwinners for their families, but the translators for their families, navigating the ocean of bureaucratic paperwork for their families, very quickly picking these things up, and also being sort of reintroduced to a concept of childhood, as if that could make up for what they learned. Because what they learned on the road is what I'm beginning to call, they didn't get a continuity of formal education, but they got kind of an education in precarity. Okay? They learned all kinds of interesting and useful skills on the road. So here are some scenes from before their departure across the Aegean, as they watched the tides and waited for notification from the smuggler that they eventually selected. And I was fortunate to be received by them at that time. And we spent a couple of days figuring out what paperwork they needed, making multiple copies of it to hide in different layers of their clothing, waterproofing everything, and we were, taping things and using great rolls of cellophane, which they don't usually use, but to waterproof things, and then sewing little caches of cash and paper into different layers of their clothing, trying to figure out how many layers of clothing they would need. What do you pack when you have only a backpack and it's likely to be thrown away? What happens if they throw it away? Where do you secrete that last pocket of cash, et cetera, et cetera? Or down in the bottom picture here, pictures that they sent me from the road, from the miserable, freezing cold Macedonian border camp where they spent the months of February and March last year, literally in a pitched camp in the middle of a freezing mud puddle. So they learned all kinds of survival skills. The technical definition of this concept of precarity, we can, and I think this is a useful one in the educational world generally, because again, this doesn't just apply to my Syrian interlocutors. It probably applies to some of your students, people who are migrating from other parts of the world, who have learned so much about how the world works on their trip. In Lauren Berlant's words, In precarity, there's a loss of faith in a fantasy world. So we started out with that bright, aspirational picture of rights and goals that individuals have, rights that we like to think we all have, and the ability to provide education for all kids that most well-thinking people have. But what these kids are learning is, again, a loss of faith in a fantasy world to which generations have become accustomed, that no one's going to take care of you, you have to take care of yourself. Precarity has also been defined as a situation of ongoing unpredictability and insecurity in which people may be displaced and are frequently the objects of violence. Again, you can think of so many at-risk populations in your own practice, in your own schools, in your own communities that are really getting an education in precarity more perhaps than learning the basic skills that our collective investment in the right to education is all about. Here's a picture of one of the youngest children, the 9-year-old, wielding his favorite learning device, a mobile phone, and he was lucky enough to come from a family with resources to have Arabic satellite TV. And it was kind of a comedy of errors, this particular middle-class family that I describe, hopefully not take advantage of in the narrative. But it's as they left their middle-class life in Syria, there were all these questions. Do we take the car? Do we take our mother's good car? Do we take the little car? What about the washing machine? We're going to need a washing machine. Can we take the washing machine? And eventually all these things that they think about and they manage, they sort of move across borders with an ever-shrinking pile of stuff. But here in Turkey, they still had the computer. They managed to take their desktop computer. They reacquired mobile phones. By this point, the washing machine had been left behind in Tripoli in Lebanon. The car had long since been sold to fund part of, the $10,000 to $15,000 that all these families back in 2013 were paying to make it into one of these boats to risk their lives across the Aegean. And so here he is with his mobile telephone. So continuing with our discussion of precarity, daily life is now the production, surveillance, and management of information. In order to make it, to run past the Serbian police or to figure out how to get fresh food in a Macedonian refugee camp or what have you. There were many times when they were sick over the course of their stay, and they would have to go to the medical tent, and on the medical tent there's a big sign saying, "We can provide medical information. Don't ask us for anything else. All we can do is treat basic illnesses. We cannot give you legal advice." So know where to go to get the kind of treatment, to get the kind of clinical care that you need, to get the kind of information you need. Migration, economic crisis, intensification of fear about national security. That's more about precarity for us than for these migrants. But what Berlant describes is an exhaustion from constant change, uncertainty, and unpredictability of economic, social, cultural, and even your biological, medical life. You're just constantly under stress. Precarity, as Butler argues, is often used, and this is kind of the dark underbelly of this story. If everybody makes it to Germany and is integrated into a thoughtful, excellent, accommodating educational program with teachers who care, that is like the happy ending to this story. And for our two families, this is pretty much how the story ends. They're in schools, the kids are learning German. As one family put it, the state here is like your mother and father. They take care of you. They give you what you need. But if that doesn't happen, and clearly that is not happening for the majority of people, precarity can be used to justify a defensive, self-protectionist response involving closing down, violence towards others, and production of flexible discourses of othering. And it's an interesting juncture that, as you all know as educators, if it goes well, it can be transformative and life-changing within the community. And if it goes badly, as it was in those ad hoc schools along the way, or if growing children are left to their own devices, and I've seen this in other parts of my research, they can wind up being defensive, self-protectionist, exhibiting othering behavior, and even violence towards others, simply as a protective device. And I think you can see this in other contexts, especially educational ones as well. So this is the family as they took their last family portrait before getting on that boat to cross the Aegean. So they learned lots of things. Here's a picture that they sent me as the boat was taking off. And if I didn't blur their faces in this picture, you could see the anxiety and the anxiousness as people get in this overcrowded little boat. Often they make several tries, as they've paid thousands of dollars for every place on a boat, and clearly their lives are in serious danger. The statistics are horrifying. They learned about paperwork, they learned about bureaucracy, they learned about camp life and camp management. The first schools they saw in Europe were actually the gymnasiums and multi-purpose rooms that had been converted into temporary housing, and this was a place that they spent a couple of weeks in when they finally were able to get out of the Macedonian border area and back to Athens. A very interesting aspect of all this that I hope to consider is the exchange of information and the formation of networks via social media. I remember in the worst of their Macedonian crisis last February, I was in contact with them, so they were in contact with me. I was madly searching the news to try and give them information about when the border might open, how long they might need to stay in place, and I would find secondary articles. But they had access to a network of social media. At one point, I found an article on social media. I sent it to them, and they were like, dude, we wrote that. So again, the idea was that they are in a hyper-intense information network where that has nothing to do with our best intentions, our attempts to intervene in the situation. They knew exactly where to go. They knew exactly what paperwork you needed. And for better or for worse, these Facebook groups that are closed groups with hundreds of thousands of members sharing and pooling their information. So when you get to this border, this is what you do. When you get to that border, that's what you do. Very interesting. We spent a lot of time also navigating long distance, the city of Athens, where I would try and find places for them to stay. We would send back and forth maps, Google Maps, and routes and things like that. Again, so the kids in this process are learning a whole different set of skills. In our cases, it ended happily, and the families were reunited with their relatives who had already made it to Germany. The outlook for these families looks really great. But again, one cannot help but think of all the other families, all the other institutions. And again, in our academic study of education, we've tended to focus on the building up of these schools as disciplinary institutions. Well, what happens when all of that goes to hell? What happens when that all begins to crumble? And so I would appreciate your thoughts, your experiences, and your feedback on this notion of precarious education moving into an education in precarity. So thank you very much.